Good evening. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for the program this evening. My name is Wesley Cudney, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The SAB is a bipartisan group. As a member of the SAB, I get access to many great opportunities by being involved with the Institute. If you are a KU student and are interested in joining, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. For this evening's event, if you'd like to know more about our guest, the event itself, upcoming Institute events, and more, you can download a printable program handout. The link is in the YouTube event description. At the end of this evening's event, we will have time for you to ask questions of our guests. Please type your questions in the YouTube chat box on your screen. Please hold all questions until the end of the program. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Questions that are distracting, disrespectful, or attempt to dominate the chat will be deleted and the user will be removed. This evening's program is closed captioned for the hearing impaired. Now please join me in welcoming Director of the Institute, Bill Lacy.
Thank you very much, Wesley. Thank you very much, Wesley. We appreciate everyone joining us tonight. And I want to start tonight with our co-sponsors. Our co-sponsors are the KU School of Business, the KU School of Law, the KU Department of Economics, the Lawrence Chamber of Commerce, and the Kansas Chamber of Commerce. And we appreciate their co-sponsorship and their support of tonight's very important program. It is my great honor to introduce tonight the Chancellor of the University of Kansas, Chancellor Doug Girod. Chancellor?
Good evening and welcome to the Digital Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Doug Girod. I'm Chancellor here at the University of Kansas, home to the Dole Institute of Politics, and tonight's discussion will be moderated by Bill Lacy, Director of the Institute. Our guest this evening is United States Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer. Ambassador Lighthizer is the first cabinet member of a seated president to be a guest at the Dole Institute, so we're delighted to have him tonight. The ambassador previously served as the Deputy United States Trade Representative for President Ronald Reagan, and he served as Chief of Staff to the United States Senate Committee on Finance for Chairman Bob Dole. So it's a great pleasure tonight to welcome Ambassador Robert Lighthizer. Welcome.
Bob, this is Bill Lacy. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, Bill. How are you? How's Kansas?
Oh, Kansas is great. It's great to be able to host you. We really appreciate your time.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in real life, but I'll get another chance to do it, I'm sure.
I hope that is the case. Let's start with a little bit of personal background, Bob. Can you share your upbringing and your education?
So I was born in a small town in Ohio. It's called Ashtabula. It was an industrial town in an agricultural county on Lake Erie, somewhere between Cleveland and Erie, Pennsylvania. Went to grade school there, went to high school outside of Cleveland, and then went to Georgetown University. And then Georgetown University Law School with a period in between in the Army Reserves. So I got to Washington and I just never seemed to leave.
Talk about your various roles with Senator Bob Dole.
So first of all, let me say that I feel like I've been working for Kansas for most of my life. You know, when you work for somebody like Senator Dole, it's basically, you know this, Bill, it's basically like the priesthood, right? You're ordained and then you just keep the job forever. And that's the kind of a situation I have. So I've got a lot of Kansans on my staff. I worry about Kansas all the damn time. I even root sometimes for KU. And I know Kim Wells is out there. He's one of my friends who you know well, and he's watching. He was the first probably Dole guy that I met, and that was probably in about 1977, if you can imagine. We talked about whether I should come to work, be an advisor to this or that. By 1978, at the end of the year, Senator Dole was going to become the ranking Republican on the Senate Finance Committee, and he asked me to come in and put together a staff for him, which I did. And I stayed in that job until I went into the Reagan administration in April of 1983. So, but that wasn't the end of my servitude. It continued in all other jobs throughout the rest of my life, as near as I can tell. I was worried about Senator Dole and Kansas, and it's a good cause. It's funny. If you look at a map and you look at where Ashtabula, Ohio is, it's like in the eastern 20th percentile of the United States, if you look at the continental United States. But in terms of flavor and thought process and culture and values, it's precisely the same as Kansas. Rural Ohio is exactly like Kansas. And like a lot of other states, even west of Kansas. So it's funny when you look at America, you think, my goodness, this, a foreigner might say he's from the East, but it really was exactly the same as the Midwest. In all respects that really matter to people. So we did a lot of great things together. Senator Dole, I put together a staff. He was a great boss. He was flying high and ended up even flying higher in those days. You remember he had been on the ticket with Gerald Ford a year or so before I met him. So he was a national figure. He'd run the party. He was a very important senator, destined to become much more important, of course. We all know that history. And I learned a great deal from him and worked for him with a great staff, by the way, of really, really, really talented people for a number of years. And we passed the Reagan economic bills, and we cut taxes and we raised taxes. We did the Social Security bill, which was sort of things that were thought of as it's quite impossible, and then just hundreds and hundreds of other things. So it was a delight, hard work, long hours, but just a delight, and I learned a great deal from him.
And you moved over from that role, I believe, to working as deputy trade rep with the Reagan administration. Kind of talk about what your objectives were in that role and what you did and what you feel was accomplished under President Reagan.
Well, I'm a big fan of President Reagan, as you can imagine. There's a whole generation of Americans who were inspired by President Reagan, much in the same way I think a generation was inspired by John Kennedy, right? It's a very similar kind of phenomenon. In the case of Reagan, it was more philosophical, probably than it was with Kennedy. Kennedy was probably more generational. But there was a philosophy, there was a feeling there was a problem in the country, and an awful lot of us felt called to public service. I know I did. As I said, I was well trained by Senator Dole, and then I went and I was the deputy to Bill Brock, who had been a senator from Tennessee and ran the Republican Party, as did Senator Dole. And when I was there, I negotiated a variety of agreements, international agreements involving carbon steel, specialty steel. We worked on automobiles, semiconductors. I did a big agriculture deal with the Soviet Union. You'll recall, just to give you a little bit of perspective, you'll recall that in 79 and then in 80, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan to kind of show you how things never quite change. And Jimmy Carter cut off grain sales, which was just a very, very significant thing he did. It was very, very hurtful to an awful lot of the agriculture belt. And then by 1983, Ronald Reagan had decided that we should start dealing with them again, and Bill Brock asked me to negotiate that deal. So that was probably the first big deal that I did. It was a big grain purchase agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. That was several months in several cities of negotiating with my Soviet counterparts. But it was another good experience. I love Ronald Reagan. I thought he was just an inspiring, wonderful person, and my boss Bill Brock was a terrific boss. I was a fairly young person. I flew around and negotiated, worked on trade policy, and also dealt a fair amount with the Hill because policy involves the Hill.
Okay. How does serving as a member of the cabinet differ from other roles that you've had in Washington, D.C.?
So there's in the first place, it's a higher level job, obviously. In second place, you have much more contact with the president. And I kind of hesitated because when you ask the question, how does it differ being in the cabinet? It really depends on who the president is. Some presidents use their cabinet, some presidents don't. Some presidents use the cabinet offices, but don't convene a cabinet. So it really depends on what you're doing, what your relationship is with the president, how important he thinks what you're doing is. Those are the kind of things that kind of define what that experience is like. For me, it was terrific because President Trump really cares about the trade issue. It's one of the reasons he ran for office was because he thought these trade deficits and are losing our manufacturing jobs and other jobs around to our trading partners around the world. Being treated unfairly was a problem. So he cares about what I do probably as much or more than anything else that he does. So being in the cabinet, is terrific. We have cabinet meetings from time to time, but mostly it's as a cabinet official dealing directly with the president and as part of the economic team. So on the economic team, you would have the Secretary of Treasury, you would have Larry Kudlow, who's the National Economic Council director, you would have me, you would have Secretary Ross, and then you would have other people depending on what the basic issue is. In my area, you'd also have, of course, another great Kansan, Mike Pompeo, involved in a lot of issues. So because he has equities and all of that. So it's a question of working together, working at that level, the level just below the president and the vice president, and then working together with the team. But it's been a terrific experience. We've gotten an enormous amount done. The president set out to do certain things in our area, and I think he did them.
You mentioned working very closely with the president, Mr. Ambassador. I'm curious. How much leeway do you have versus having to take direct direction from the president?
Well, once again, it depends. In my area, remember, it's an area that he knows, he cares about. It's one of the reasons he ran for president. It's one of the reasons he was elected president. I do my own negotiating. I know the kinds of issues that he has to be consulted on and has to make a decision on. When we're hot in a negotiation, I would talk to him every day, sometimes more than once a day. He wants to be kept involved, kept up to date. But in terms of decision making, the day-to-day negotiating, I know what he wants. I think very much the same way in my area. I know what our philosophy is. So it's not like he micromanages, but there are certain issues that you just want to make sure that the president is making the decision because he's the elected official, right? I'm just a staff person, pure and simple. An elevated staff person, but a staff person. And if the president was elected, he's the one that has to answer to the people. And so, we always made sure that he made the decisions and knew what we were doing. And then, to be honest, on many of them, not so much in the negotiations, but in other policy matters that we do, and we can talk about all of those, there's a debate. And the president likes that method of making a decision, and I like it too. So you You'd have the President of the United States at the Resolute desk, which is famous for the Kennedy picture, remember, with the kid sticking out through the little thing underneath. It's the same desk. And there'll be 4 or 5 people sitting right in front of the desk in a semicircle, and the president will whoever's responsible will make say, here's the issue we're trying to debate, and here's my side of it, and other people will make theirs, and the president will interact, and you'll have a lively discussion. And at a time, the president will say, here's my decision. This is what I want to do. And if you don't agree with it, you can have another shot at it, but then he'll make the decision, and then we all walk out and say, fine, that's the decision. And then we all implement it. It's an interesting thing, this whole decision process. When we sat around the room and I was very young in the Reagan administration, I would be with other deputies in meetings, and I would always say, what would Reagan do, right? What would Reagan do? And that was kind of like your guiding principle, because we all thought like him. I feel the same way with President Trump. I say, what would President Trump do if he, given his instincts and where he wants to lead the country, if he knew what I knew about this subject right now? And then that's what I try to do. I try to do in the best way possible what he wants to get done and do it as professionally as I can.
You spent a fair amount of time in public service and also law practice. And I'm curious as to your advice that you would give to students who are studying law at KU as to which of those, what are the differences in those areas, and did you have a preference?
Well, in the first place, for the law students, people tell me what would I say to law students to have them have a successful legal career. This is a little different than what you ask, but my answer always is learn to read and write, particularly write English, right? The difference between great lawyers and good lawyers is that you can write. So you just have to learn how to write. When you talk about public service versus the law firm, my strong recommendation is that people plan a career path, if they're interested in public service, that goes in and out of both. There are people who make a career out of public service, and I admire them. There are a lot of them in this building. A lot of them work for me, good lawyers. But for me, it made more sense to spend time in the private sector as well as time in the government. And one of the beauties of our system is that you can do that. And you don't have to just be in Washington to do it. You can do it in Kansas, or you can do it wherever. And there are a lot of people, I'm sure, listening to this program that have had that experience and know that what I'm talking about, that it makes sense. I think everyone ought to do some public service, or at least give it serious thought. There was a time, when I was young, and even before, when I was quite young, where everyone really served for some period of time in the military. Some people basically did public service. It's just very good for the person who's doing it. It's very good for the country. And it's good to kind of create a sense of community, in the United States, which is something we really have to work on as a nation. So I've enjoyed both, and I recommend both to your listeners, particularly those in the law.
Bob, can you spend a few minutes telling us a little bit about what the president kind of said is your guideline, your direction when you became U.S. Trade Rep? And can you also talk about the main focus that you've had in this role?
So in terms of direction, the president's view is, and my view is, and has been for a long, long time, and so has the president's view been for a long, long time. And we didn't, I didn't work for him until the administration, but we've had similar views. Is that we have a trade policy that is not serving working people well. We have made a mistake. We've let economists dictate what our trade policy is. And what the objective was efficiency in the market. And basically, that was the blind objective. Now, a lot of economists, and I'm not saying that shouldn't be an objective, but it shouldn't be the only objective. So the notion was we're going to do trade deals. If it makes things cheaper, then that's a good agreement. And then if you're heartless, you would say, well, what happens to working people, that's just the way it is. And if you're not heartless, you would say, we'll take money from the public treasury and redistribute it to people who are hurt by this policy. The president's view is very different. His view is we should start with the proposition that the objective of economic policy, of which part of is trade policy. The objective should be helping working people so that we have stronger families and stronger communities. That should be what the objective is. And you use the tools to get to that point. And one of the things you would consider, of course, is efficiency, the effect on the market, and whether it'll make America more competitive. But you also are concerned about the working men and women of America. It's kind of an anti-corporatist kind of a view, to be perfectly honest. It's kind of an anti-globalist point of view. But it is the philosophy that he has and the philosophy that I have. You have to realize that probably close to 60% of working Americans do not have a college education. Those people have to have good jobs. They have to be able to have strong families and strong communities. I always say we need jobs, and we want to live in a community where children are proud of their parents because they go to work and do something constructive, and parents have hope for their children. And that is our objective. In the past, if you look at how we negotiated agreements, we either did nothing and let business decide what will happen to jobs in the United States, or we negotiated agreements, the result of which was, not the intention, of course, because everyone has the right intention, I think, but the result of which was we outsourced a lot of jobs. So if you think about it, the first really big deal that we did in the United States was in 1994, and we did this NAFTA deal. And then after that, we started the WTO. You know, we can go through the history of that, or people interested, maybe some of the students are, and I'd be happy to kind of take them through the way we think about this kind of history, because it's important to understand the history of these things. And then the next big thing was we had China join the WTO, and the United States agreed to give them most favored nation treatment, all right, in 2000, right at the end of the Clinton administration. Well, during that period until 2016, we lost about 5 million manufacturing jobs. We lost 60,000 factories. Now, an economist might, some of which are probably listening right now and gritting their teeth, an economist would say, well, but it's more efficient and T-shirts are cheaper and, you know, we all have televisions. It doesn't matter whether they're made in Korea or China or the United States. Our view is that that's wrong, that we should have a policy that's designed to bring those jobs within reason, right? Within reason. It's complicated and it's technical, and there's a spectrum you have to go across. But we started with an objective. We wanted to bring manufacturing jobs back, and we want to get the trade deficit down, all right? And if you said sort of how would I score us, I would say the trade deficit was down before coronavirus. The trade deficit was down in 5 of the previous 6 quarters, down substantially now. We created 6 million jobs. This is up to February or March, and about 500,000 manufacturing jobs came back to the United States. These are jobs that we were told would never come back, largely because people thought we were sort of post-industrial. And then finally, and probably the most important statistic, is that in 2019, the last full year we have before this virus hit, median family income was up 6.8%. That's the highest in American history. So we had a different policy. We had a different objective. The president was quite clear about that. Now that objective, that direction translates into, 100,000 other decisions you have to make along the way. But we had a different objective. The president was quite clear about it. He wants to get the trade deficits down. He does not want us to lose jobs or outsource American jobs. He views these huge trade deficits as really losing wealth of the United States, and he wanted to stop. And we were on a course to do that. Now these things take time. It's like turning a cruise ship would be the analogy that most people would use. But it takes time. But we clearly had done that, and I think what we did is we changed the way people think about trade in the country, politically, but also everyday Americans. And I think it was a very powerful, successful thing that he did.
You mentioned, Mr. Ambassador, NAFTA, which was a big trade agreement back in the administration. What are the challenges to making major changes in a piece of legislation or in an agreement like that?
So, well, when we started off, remember now, the president ran on this, and condemning NAFTA was not just a partisan issue. The previous presidents and candidates on both sides also ran on it, on renegotiating NAFTA because it was a bad deal. But up till this, no one had actually done it. There hadn't even been 1 minute. If you look back, everybody had campaigned on it on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, but no one had done anything about it. And so the president just said, listen, I campaigned on this. This has to change. So the first thing you have to do is you have to be willing to walk away from the agreement and say, if we don't get changes, we're just going to leave this agreement. This agreement is bad for the United States. We have large trade deficits, and they're growing. Let me give you a case in point, because this is kind of interesting. If you look at the previous 11 automobile plants in North America before we started renegotiating NAFTA, 8 of them were built in Mexico. So basically, and then all the parts facilities were falling. So basically, what was happening was the United States automobile industry was moving to Mexico, and that was something it's one of the most significant industries because it spawned so much else in technology and parts and everything. Basically, that industry was moving to Mexico. So we had to have an agreement that stopped that. We had to have an agreement that bring those jobs back so the new facilities are made in the United States. And when I say the factories were moving to Mexico, they were moving there really to sell cars in the United States. In some cases to export from Mexico to other places, but the vast majority of those cars came back to the United States. So we were basically outsourcing an awful lot of jobs. I mean, that's just one example. So what were our objectives? Our objectives in that were to bring manufacturing back, to put in place just the gold standard of rules on things like financial services and e-commerce and digital trade and all of these kinds of things. And then we put in place a sunset, which was very controversial. And the notion of the sunset was that we can't be in a position where an agreement is eternal. I mean, what is there about trade agreements that says we should never look at them again, right? That was kind of the nutty notion that people generally had. We need certainty, they would say. And then we would never change these agreements, and they would get worse and worse in the United States, and they wouldn't do anything about it. So we put in place a sunset. And then we had a variety of other things that are fairly technical. But the result was to have the best rules we can have for North America, so North America is competitive, and bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States and other jobs, and stop the outsourcing. Those were our objectives. We were told it was impossible. You couldn't do it. You couldn't get the Mexicans and Canadians to agree. It couldn't happen. In fact, it did. And it took about a year to negotiate. And then we worked with the Democrats in the Congress, particularly in the Hill, and made some additional changes, particularly in the area of labor rights so that we ended up with an agreement really that had the most progressive, I would say, labor enforcement provisions, the most progressive environmental enforcement provisions, literally in trade history. And I worked very closely with the Speaker and the Democratic Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, just a wonderful guy named Rich Neal, and his Republican counterpart, Kevin Brady, as well as a number of senators. And that took a long time, too, because there's a lot of politics involved in that. But when it was all done, we got about 90% of the Congress to vote for it, just about everyone. And they said it was impossible to negotiate. It was impossible to get Democrats to vote for the agreement. You heard all this, right? Now, when you look back, people think, well, of course it wasn't impossible. Well, the reality is that was the general view. And we worked hard. It took a couple of years, and it went into effect this last summer. There's a lot of technical work. The whole agreement is 2,000 or 3,000 pages long. I mean, it's a huge technical thing. But we got it all done, and we got it. It was bipartisan, and just a wonderful victory for the president, but a victory also for the Speaker, and a real victory for working people in the United States.
Yeah, it's definitely a very positive thing by all accounts. Let me ask you this, Bob. You've had the opportunity to work with President Reagan and with President Trump. Could you describe their similarities or differences on trade policy?
Well, it's funny. Let's deal first with President Reagan. President Reagan would say that he was, in fact, a free trader. That's what President Reagan would say. And he would talk about free trade and really and the benefits of it. But he also knew that we had to take action to protect our own people, and that we had to insist on fair trade from our allies. But if you look at what he wrote, and what he said, it was very much in a free trade way. If you look at what we did during that time, it was very cognizant of unfairness by our trading partners and very focused on American workers. So we put in place voluntary restraining agreements to stop imports on steel. We put in place provisions to stop imports of automobiles, semiconductors, until American companies could build up in those areas. If you remember the famous Harley-Davidson case, where he put in place tariffs to protect Harley-Davidson. So Ronald Reagan did an enormous amount of things that were similar in flavor to what we're doing now. So I think that's, but when he left, some of the libertarian types would say he was a protectionist, although he himself would define himself as a free trader. But I would say there's a fundamental difference, not just between President Reagan and President Trump, but we have to think back. The 1980s, we had a bad trade situation. But by 2016, it would become catastrophic. It wasn't a bad trade situation. It was a catastrophic trade situation. So what had happened was, I mentioned NAFTA, the creation of the WTO and China entering it. And we went from having trade deficits of, I can't remember, I would say at the beginning of the Reagan administration, when I was working for Senator Dole, the trade deficit was maybe 30 to 40 billion dollars a year, and we thought it was horrible. By the time that President Trump was elected, it was 800,000. I mean, $800 billion a year. $800 billion a year. We had a trade deficit with China that was $400 billion a year. So you could see it had gotten totally out of whack. So Reagan took a lot of strong steps to protect America, but he was operating in an environment where there was a brush fire. By the time President Trump got there, it was not a brush fire anymore. It was the whole bloody house was on fire. And he had to take stronger steps, and he did do that. In terms of philosophy, they both were very, very similar in that they both cared about working people. Ronald Reagan was very concerned about working people. And the term that everyone used was the Reagan Democrats, right? That was the notion. The notion in those days was that working class people were basically Democrats, and that business people were Republicans. I mean, that was really an extreme thing, but that was kind of the general notion. And then there was this great surprise when all these working people came over to vote for Ronald Reagan. And those people basically stayed on more or less as things move forward. And that same group in massive amounts is the reason that President Trump was elected president, right? Because of those same people that we would have called in the 80s Reagan Democrats, working class people voted for him. So, there's clearly that difference. There also is a difference probably in style, right, between the two. One's a businessman, one's is a movie star / actual politician. Everybody talked about Ronald Reagan being a movie star, but he was 8 years governor of California. He was a serious politician. I would say that between the two, thinking about it, President Trump is much more hands-on. Part of that's his personality as a business person. He wants to know what the details are. And part of it also is that trade for him is central, where for Reagan it wasn't central, right? Central for Reagan was fighting the Soviet Union and getting taxes down, right? They had different kind of focuses. But they were probably more similar than they are different, to be honest, because they're both inspiring. They both have the same basic objective, at least in my area, which is working people. And of course, I've spent much more time with President Trump because I have a higher position than I did with President Reagan. But I always enjoy the time I spent with President Reagan.
Mr. Ambassador, when you're negotiating trade policy, how do you balance out international and domestic implications of what you're doing?
Well, I would say, first of all, let's take a step back, because I think this gives you a notion. So if you said, Bob, you say that we had all these bad deals and we basically were hurting ourselves and hurting working people over a period of time. Why did that happen? So let's take a step back, all right? Trade, let's divide trade, the history of the world, into two different things, all right? Before World War II, you had tariff policy, not tariff policy, trade, and it kind of went through an evolution, which we could talk about if any of the students are interested. But you had Republicans who basically wanted tariffs, called themselves protectionists, because they wanted to help industry. And then you had Democrats, really in a Jeffersonian kind of a tradition, even going back that far, who would say we don't want tariffs, we're sort of more agriculture. And you kind of had that was going on. Then we got to World War II. And World War II changed everything. After World War II, the United States is the only really rich country in the world, right? And we set up a system, and we have a system that set up the monetary system. We have the UN created, and then we have what becomes the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is now the WTO. So we have these three pillars going on. And the view really was that we should make trade deals that help create prosperity in Europe and in Asia, right? That was the objective. And it was for good reason. We were fighting the Soviet Union. We wanted to make sure that our allies in it could recover. And we did that for a period of time, all right? And after a while, it didn't make sense to do it anymore, right? After a while, it was a mistake. And you saw that evolution. When you were in the Reagan period, it still probably made sense to do it somewhat. That is to say, have rounds of trade liberalizing. The objective was not to create manufacturing in the United States, but really to make sure that we have a stable world order. And if it costs the United States a fair amount to do it, then so be it. Then if you get to 1962, you have John Kennedy says, look, we're sacrificing he doesn't say it quite this way, but this is the notion. We're sacrificing our economic prowess for foreign policy grounds too much. We need to create a United States trade representative. It's called the Special Trade Representative, but not this office that I now hold, started by John Kennedy. And he put as the first USTR Christian Herter, who had been Eisenhower's Secretary of State. And the notion was to make sure that we're not just having the State Department, who's more interested in global matters, make these agreements because they were not necessarily be in the economic interest of the United States. That then continued, became more of a problem with Reagan. Then when we got into the 90s, it was demonstrably a bad decision, but yet we were kind of doubling down on it by letting China in the WTO and doing the NAFTA kind of a deals. By the time we got in the late 90s into the 2000s, it was apparent that this was costing us way more than the value. We didn't even have a Soviet Union anymore to worry about. And we had sort of gotten onto a track of negotiating rounds and thinking more in terms of just eliminating tariffs, eliminating barriers, and not what the consequences were for working people in the United States. I mean, that's more or less the evolution. So that by the time you got to President Trump, his view was, hold it, time out. I got to worry about the working people. The reason I say that, because your question implies, how do I do this kind of a balance? My view is other people are going to worry about the international implications of things. Somebody else is going to worry about the global implications. That's why we hired, Mike Pompeo. He's going to worry about that. I'm going to worry about the trade effects, the economic effects. That's more or less the way I think of it. Now, if you said, is that 100% true? I'd say no. It's definitely not 100% true. But notionally, when I get into a trade deal, I'm transactional. Right? I want to make sure at the end of the day, there's more jobs, more wealth, more farm sales in the United States than there was before, and that I'm doing better than the other person. I don't start with the proposition that I'm going to give you a deal because you're a friend and I need friends, right? I'm going to let somebody else worry about the friend part of this. I'm going to worry about the workers. So that's how I balance it. Do I think about the geopolitics? Yeah, from time to time. But I don't think that should be my focus. Somebody else is paid to worry about that. My focus is to get a deal that's going to create jobs, wealth, put pressure on wages, raise wages in the United States. That's what my objective is.
What would you define as the major accomplishments of the administration on trade?
So first of all, I think we've had enormous accomplishments. If you think about it, you have to think about it in a couple different ways. First of all, if you said, well, what deals did you do? Well, we renegotiated NAFTA. We had what's really the biggest and best trade agreement ever negotiated by far in the United States. It's like almost $1.4 trillion worth of trade. We did this massive remake of our relationship with China in the so-called Phase 1 deal. We did a very significant and in any other time massive, but not in the compared to some of the other things, deal with Japan, which is really, really important. We can talk about. We did a deal with Korea. And then we did scores of smaller deals where we worked things out with Indonesia and a whole variety of countries. So that's what we accomplished. But if you say conceptually, what should we be most well known for and happiest about is, one, we changed the way people think about trade. We changed the way, and this is Republicans, by the way, because a lot of Republicans were pure free traders. And the Democrats were more sensitive in many cases to the needs of working people historically in this area. Not always. I mean, there were some who were like Kennedy, who would be a very free trader, even though he was, a liberal Democrat. But we changed the way people think about trade. We changed about what the way people in Washington do, but also around the world. And secondly, the president changed the way people think about China. And had people realize that China's a problem, and that is on the Hill, but also among everyday working Americans. I talk to a lot of them all the time, a lot of business people. There's a realization there that we have got to take care of ourselves, and we had to reset that relationship. And I think those are two really, really significant things. So I answered it, one, by giving the deals, but two, more importantly, by these two huge changes in the way people think. And I believe that going forward, those two things, the way people think about trade and the China thing, will not go back. I think those are permanent changes, and they're bipartisan changes now. They're accepted by both sides. So, I mean, that's what I'm proudest of. And it was by no means apparent that it was going to happen. And in many ways, really, it was against all odds. Everyone sort of said, this is all crazy. And if I told you how many people, Bill, came up to me in the last months and said, when you started all this, I really did think you were crazy. But now I agree with you, which is like the ultimate compliment, right? That I thought you were a lunatic, but now I think you're a decent person. So I'm proud of what we've done. I think the president will go down in history on these things, particularly the China thing, and I'm really happy to have been a part of it. It's one of the reasons, to kind of get back to the students. It's one of the reasons that your students should think about going and doing public service. I mean, everything's not as grand as that, right? But there are millions of people in public service in the United States right now. Not that aren't doing the deal with China, but that are dealing things that are every bit as significant to working people in their own community. And so it really is a rewarding part of public service.
You and I both have had the opportunity to work for Senator Dole, and he's such an extraordinary public servant and really legislator, everything. Could you speak a little bit to what you believe Senator Dole's legacy is?
Goodness, I've spent a lot of time. So obviously he's a friend and a mentor, and I told you it's like 43 years ago. I mean, I was quite young and he was barely shaving when I first met him. That's how long ago it was. And he isn't like I'm defining him, right? He's been defined many times over. He's obviously a military hero and a man of the people who accomplished something from humble beginnings, all of which is admirable. But what he really was a principled legislator, right? He was a man who had certain ideas. He compromised to get things done, and was just a master of the Senate, right? He was a master legislator. He thought like a legislator. His brain operated that way. When you remember he ran for president, you probably recall. I can remember at least 3 times that I was involved, happily in each time. He would give speeches, you'll recall sometimes, and when you listen to him, you would think you sound like a legislator, right? In other words, he would talk about, well, HR, and you remember all this, right? Because we would go through it. He was a 24-hour-a-day legislator, and that means you have to know the material, and you got to be willing to compromise. And I worked for him, and got down, did the nitty-gritty for him. I always found it more difficult to compromise than he did. I will say that. He was more of a let's get it done, let's move on. But people still talk all these years later with reverence about Senator Dole, and I of course do. He's thought of as someone who can get things done. People always talk about the bipartisanship. That's, of course, true, although the world was a little more bipartisan in those days. But he was willing to compromise to get most of what he wanted and to keep everyone kind of on board and happy. So and if you look at if you wanted to define what he did, you would go down and you would list legislation, right? Key piece of legislation that he put together, and it's everything from taxes to farm bills to legislation for the handicapped. I mean, it's just a variety of things. He would just get on it, hook into it, and he would just hang in there and stay with it, and eventually he'd come out the other side. I'm very proud, you can tell, to have worked for him.
Yes, I agree with that completely. I have one final question, then we're going to open it up to audience questions and answers. And Mr. Ambassador, you referenced this a few minutes ago, but I wonder if you could speak to it a little bit more specifically. We have a very strong student culture at the Dole Institute, and a lot of students are watching tonight. And I'm curious, what advice would you give them about going through college with an eye towards public service? What should they be doing now to prepare themselves?
Gee, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, if I were going to school, and unfortunately, when I went to school, I didn't have quite as much wisdom as I have now. I had about as much wisdom as everyone else who goes to school, right? But I think if you want to get involved in public service, first of all, you just want to be the best student you can be. Let's just be honest, right? Just flat out. Whatever your major, whatever, you want to be the hardest working best student, because those are the skills you're going to need if you want to excel at public service, like if you want to excel in the private sector. So I would say, first of all, really be a hardworking student who's trying to learn how to write and trying to learn how to think about things, because that's what you're going to be doing. And then the next thing I would say is study policy, right? I mean, it depends on what you're doing, and there's lots of kinds of public service, but it's the policy implications of things that always sort of interested me and their effect on people, right? Because public service is in fact service, and you want to think about things in terms of the way they affect people. But more than anything else, if you do well and you just set out and decide you want to do it, this is a great country where anybody can get involved in public service. And as I say, even if you don't do it all the time, all of your career, do it for part of your career. It's a rewarding thing to do, even if it's just for a very small part of your career, or part time while you're pursuing your career.
Okay, we've got some questions from the audience, Bob. Our first question is, have you been in discussions with the Biden transition team regarding the continuity of trade policy?
No, the answer is no. I've not done that. I work very closely with Democrats, have all the way down the line. So none of this is going to be, any kind of a problem for us. We'll have to see how it all works out, right? There's all kinds of things going on that front. But from my point of view, no, not with the transition team. Although, as I say, I work and talk to Democrats every day. Democrats, for the most part, in Congress.
Okay, we're still waiting for additional questions, but this one came up. You mentioned the WTO, the World Trade Organization, earlier tonight. Can you describe their role in trade policy?
So let's, just because hopefully somebody on this call is going to say, geez, I want to get into trade policy. That's public service. It's also got a private sector part to it too. So I mentioned I always go back to the beginning, right? So I mentioned in 1947, we started something called the International Trade Organization, the ITO, and it was negotiated. It was like the UN and the World Bank and IMF, and that was one of the things. That trade organization never was ratified by the United States. The United States Congress, it wasn't brought back and rejected. It was just clear that it was never going to pass, so they never brought it back. So what happened was the kind of agreements, the basic notions of it were kind of codified in something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which did not require congressional action, all right? And that was the GATT, and that became kind of our guiding principle. The principles were basically most favored nation, that is to say, I'm gonna treat everyone the same. If I'm gonna have a tariff, just as an example, or non-tariff barrier, but a tariff on apples, I'm gonna charge everyone the same. And then national treatment, which is to say I'm gonna treat other people, other countries in my country the same as I treat my own nationals. So those were like the two basic principles. It became more complicated like everything else. And then over a period of time, it was basically about tariff reduction. And then over a period of time, you had 8 rounds of negotiations. And in those rounds, the countries that were part of it, and it grew the number, would sit down and they'd say, I'll give up tariffs on this and you give up tariffs on that. And we had 8 rounds of those culminating in this so-called Uruguay round, the last round, which created the World Trade Organization. My premise is that during the course of those 8 rounds, we gave a lot more than we got, right? And we did it intentionally at the beginning, and then it became a habit. So Then we created something out of the GATT, which became the World Trade Organization. It's basically the same thing as the GATT. It's not really different, except they changed the name. That's how to think of it. So then you say, what really is it? This is really important because people have all kinds of crazy ideas about what the World Trade Organization is. I like to say you think of it as two things, all right? You think of it, one, as a place to negotiate, a place to sit down and negotiate big rounds, but also negotiate on things like right now fishery subsidies to try to stop people from subsidizing fisheries. So you create rules and you reduce tariffs by having a place to negotiate. And then that becomes complicated, and then there's a bureaucracy, and half the time they screw things up. But in any event, it's like every other institution, it grows into something different. But that's the one principal function. I would suggest by far the most important function is a place to negotiate, in an organized way to negotiate, all right? The other thing it is a dispute settlement process, a dispute settlement mechanism. And personally, I believe that mechanism has gone haywire, has gotten off track. And it's turned itself more into a court than a place to negotiate. And as evidence of that, we really haven't had a serious negotiation since 1994. For all these years, people have just started to litigate. So it's become more of a court. What its real purpose is to negotiate, to keep track of where the rules are, and then countries negotiate tariff deals, and then they come back and put those into their own domestic law. So it does not in any way set tariffs or anything like that. It just records what was agreed to in the negotiations. People put it into their own laws, and then it's a place to have dispute settlement. That's all it is. When you say who's the head of the WTO, the head of the WTO is more like a head of a trade association than it is the head of a corporation. Right? It's a member-driven organization that operates by consensus, and I would suggest has become too bureaucratic and become way too litigation-oriented. So I'm known as a critic. I think we have to have reform. I think that one of the things we've accomplished in this administration is that most people in the world now agree with us that we need to massively reform the WTO. But those are its functions, and that's more or less how what my sense of what it is. And I would recommend, let me just, while we have people who want to get a little more into this. I did an article, not on the WTO, but generally on our philosophy that was in Foreign Affairs magazine. And I came out in July, and you can get it online. I recommend it to people who want to kind of take the next step and think about this stuff a little more. It's a good piece. But I also had a Wall Street Journal article 6 weeks ago maybe that laid out the WTO stuff and what I think of it, what the problems are. And it's a 700-word easy read like all of those things, but it's got a fair amount of attention. So if someone has especially, or some student is thinking about that, there's a couple of places they can go and read and have some fun.
Good suggestion. Next question. What are the administration's views on the WTO government procurement agreement?
The old GPA. There was a story today that the United States wants to get out of the government procurement agreement. So what is the government procurement agreement? So it's one of the agreements. Remember I said it's a place to get together and negotiate. So one of the things they negotiated was an agreement that everyone doesn't belong to, but some do, of the WTO members. And what that agreement does is it says, I agree that I will let other people bid on my government procurement, other countries, the same as I do my own people. And then one country will say, well, I'm going to do it for these 6 departments, and somebody else will say, well, I'll do it for those departments, and it goes on like that. The United States is in the GPA. We are one of the people that has signed up, and the general view is that we have probably offered more than we got. So it would be another example of a poor negotiation that's extended over a period of time. So we're basically giving more than we're getting in the GPA. The contrary notion would be like a Buy America provision, right? Which is to say, to give some preference to American companies. On balance, my own sense is that we have to reset that a little bit. We have to have more Buy America, and to the extent we are giving access to other countries as if they were American. We have to get more access from their place than we have so far. So it's a bad negotiation. It probably needs to be reformed.
Okay, Bob asks, the Biden team says it wants to move to a multilateral effort on China and criticizes the current administration for a unilateral approach. What's your response to that?
So, let me say first of all that in political campaigns, people take positions that that they take because they want to have a different view and want to be critical, and that's a lovely bipartisan tendency, right? It's completely consistent. I would say two things about that. First, we have operated in a bipartisan way. We have something called a trilateral group. It's met for many years now that I started. We have many papers, people can look at them, and we've made real headway. In the group is Europe, all of Europe, and Japan and the United States, and we've worked very hard on that. Number two, we've also worked with our allies at the WTO to try to put in place limitations on subsidies and state-owned enterprises and the like. That hasn't accomplished much, largely because it's a consensus organization and you can't get consensus. So we have done it, so it's not a fair criticism. Although, there's lots of criticism that's not fair in a political campaign, and that's both sides do that. So then the next thing I would say on that is this. Should we work with our allies? Of course, yes, and we're doing it. But if you really believe that this is central to the well-being of your country and that we are challenged in a very fundamental way, and I do believe this to be true, and I think anyone who studies it and says they don't believe it is either a knave or a fool. So it's a fundamental issue of enormous importance to the people of the United States. You can't be in a position where you let other countries, whoever they are, dictate what your policy is on things of fundamental importance in the United States. So when people say work with your allies, if what they mean is give Europe a veto over what China does in the United States, that strikes me as completely crazy, and I have no time for it. If they mean try to bring people along, we have tried to do that. And it hasn't been easy, but I think we've had a fair amount of success. When we started out, there was an acceptance of where we were, of the status quo with China, that China was not a threat. And I think there's much more of a realization now that they are, and that they're a problem we have to deal with. And I think the president and all of us in the administration and the Secretary of State, because since I keep bringing him up because he's a Kansas guy, also gets a lot of credit for that. So A, we worked with them, and B, you can never be in a position where matters of enormous importance are subject to a veto by someone outside of the country.
Okay, I have another question from Sherman. Sherman asks, are we negotiating any more with the European Union and against the tariff imposed on the U.S.?
So, yes. In fact, I was on the phone today with, in the last couple of days with very senior people in France and in the European Commission, the EU Commission. So the answer is yes. We're working with them with respect to the tariffs. We're working with them on a whole variety of areas. Among the things we're talking about is there's a long, tortured series of WTO cases involving large commercial aircraft, and we're trying to come up with some rules on that. So the answer is yes. We're working with Europe. We have worked with Europe. I mean, Europe is one of these things that's, Europe is a lot of countries and it's complicated, but we have always got negotiations going on with the Europeans. We specifically do right now. So yes.
Okay, I have another one that's rather long from Jeremy, but I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. he speaks and asks about the strong connection between major technology in the United States and Israel's military intelligence, and is concerned about the closeness of Israel to China. Is that something that we should be concerned about in terms of technology?
Well, I don't know quite where Jeremy's going with the question, but let me just talk a little bit about it. First of all, Israel's a very close ally of the United States. That's one point. Number two is Israel's very, very good in the technology space. And there's a lot of overlap between U.S. and Israeli countries in the technology space. There also is a concern that we have not just with Israeli companies, but also with American companies, as well as European and other world companies. Other countries, companies in other countries, that we're losing technology to China. So that space generally, yeah, I would be concerned. I wouldn't necessarily single out Israel over other countries, but that's an area that I do worry about. Technology transfer, failure to protect intellectual property, technology theft, all of those areas are enormous importance to the United States and something we worry about with respect to every country, every company in the world.
Okay, I have two more questions, and that's all the time that we're going to have tonight for questions. But the first one, Lynn asked, if you could travel back to 2016 when you just started this position, what would you do differently to better serve the U.S. people?
Goodness. That's one of those questions of sort of self-reflection, that I'm good at after I get out of the job. Clearly we didn't come into the job knowing everything, and we've learned a lot from it. But I knew a lot about it because I'd actually worked in the building before as a deputy many years before. I would probably reorganize things a little differently in the building, to be honest. Looking back, there's no reason to get into it here. It's technical stuff, but there are things we could have done to reorganize. One of the things you do is you tend to prioritize what you're going to work on. And particularly in negotiating, it's like an all-consuming thing, right? It's not like it's something you can do part-time. When you're negotiating, particularly at the end of a negotiation, so say at the end of NAFTA, we had maybe 7 or 8 weeks of meeting every single day for long hours with the Mexicans, and then another month with the Canadians to kind of wrap everything up. And at that time, you're focused and you're doing your stuff. And when you look back, like from the perspective that I have now, you'd say, yeah, you could have reorganized things. You could have done things a little bit differently on an organizational basis. But I don't have any problem with the priorities that we had. I think they were the right priorities. And I absolutely have no problem with the accomplishments that we have.
We have time for one last question from Ben. Ben wants to know, what do you and your office plan to do to submit the Trump trade approach before the transition on January 20th?
Well, I mean, that's another good question, Ben. I would say in the first place, we'll see where we are. There's all this litigation is going out, and I'm not going to prejudge any of it. That I don't know anything about it, and it's kind of like out of my sphere. If we find ourselves down the road in a point where someone else has taken over, whoever it is, we'll cooperate. But the big thing is, we have changed things in fundamental ways in a bipartisan way. I think that Republicans and Democrats both, as I said, to kind of loop back a little bit, both think about trade differently than they did before. And I think that's going to continue. And I also think on the China question, I think it's going to continue. So I'm not worried. Whoever sits in my chair, under any president going down the road, I'm fairly confident that the fundamental things that we've talked about and this reorientation of policy towards working people, worrying about the challenge of China, that those things are going are going to endure, and that people will continue to make progress on them.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. An entertaining and educational program for all of us. And so we very much appreciate it and hope we can have you in person at the Dole Institute before too long.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here. I love Bob Dole, and anything that keeps his memory alive and keeps his legacy growing is great. I presume he's watching this television show, so I'm going to say hi to him right now, and everyone else can say hi to him. And I look forward to being there in person, hopefully with him one day soon, and all of us vaccinated. So thanks, Bill. It's been fun for me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bob. We're going to go back to Wesley in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to thank our audience tonight. And thank everyone for their support over the semester. It's been a challenge for us to go completely virtual from in-person programming that we've done in the past. And we want to thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you hopefully through our Digital Dole Institute Monday emailer very soon. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for our program this evening. If you are a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Join us Thursday, December 3rd for the next installment of our Fort Leavenworth Military History Series with Dr. Louis DeMarco, who will discuss the Battle of Ramadi. Refer to doleinstitute.org for up-to-date information on all of our upcoming programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, consider becoming a friend of the Dole Institute by donating to help make programs like this one possible. We hope you enjoyed this evening's program. Thank you and good night.